All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening in Ukraine, although it's morning here in America, at least in New Orleans. Welcome to the final lecture in a series of 7 lectures on American history. This last lecture is covering from really the fall of the Soviet Union to the present in American history. And in this lecture, I'll cover, American history in the 90s and 2000s, but I'll also try to focus on some parts between US and Ukrainian relations, really emphasizing or focusing on that as well, especially from the 1990s onward. Because to be honest, a lot of Ukrainian US relations is not very well known before 1990s, in part because we've always seen Ukrainian US relations in the terms of the Russian Empire or in the terms of the Soviet Empire. So, and I know that Ukraine was once independent for a few years in the 1920s, late 19 teens, but I'm not sure if we really had strong foundations then. So it's only, if you really think about it, the relations between the U.S. and Ukraine are really young, I would say. They're just starting to be built and formed. Of course, we have a very strong Ukrainian American diaspora, which has never forgotten about their Ukrainian roots, and they still honor it. But in terms of international affairs and foreign policy, it's really been in the last 30 or 20 years that we're starting to, think more about Ukraine and hopefully treating it as a separate country, not some appendage of the Soviet Union or Russia, but we're working on that. So, before I begin the lecture, I will note something very big happened yesterday, and it relates to American history. So, yesterday, our big Supreme Court ruled that, at least in federal employment practices, you are not allowed to discriminate or to fire. It's really firing a person who identifies as LGBTQ, either that they're gay or they have a gender identity that's different. So that was a big, big rule yesterday, and it was surprising because one of the conservative judges, two of the more conservative judges, voted in favor of it too, which shocked me. But it's a big deal. And what's interesting about the court case that happened yesterday is that it stems from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So they're going all the way back to the 1960s to justify, this employment practice, because the way the Supreme Court justices interpreted as, even though this Civil Rights Act was only meant to protect originally minorities, particularly women and Black and Brown Americans from employment discrimination, they interpreted that law to say, well, they probably would have also extended the same rights to LGBTQ people. It's just at the time in 1964, people weren't really thinking of LGBTQ rights. They're certainly not in the forefront like they are today. So it's just interesting. And that's why I always say, like, the civil rights movement, we often think of it as associated with Black Americans, and it is. But we have so much, at least, especially other minorities like myself as a woman, we have so much to owe to this Black civil rights movement, because all those laws that help to protect Black Americans almost always help to protect other Americans. So we owe it to them. And I owe it to MLK. I even owe it to Malcolm X. So it's weird. That's why I always say, like, the history is never past. I don't say this. Is actually a quote by William Faulkner. The past is not even past. It is not even past. No, the past is not dead. It is not even past. Excuse me. It's a famous quote by an American author, William Faulkner. So it's just, I like that. And it's a very momentous, positive change in the midst of what we have still in America. Let me minimize this. Sorry, guys. I'm viewing myself on. Sorry, I just realized I have myself on video. Sorry. So, and it's a positive change in the midst of right now in America, where we still have a lot of protests, especially against police brutality. And we continue to find more videos about Black Americans being innocently killed and often violently, abused by police officers. And it's a big struggle that America is going through right now. And we're going to have to continue to struggle through it, but it's part of our history. It's part of our culture, so to speak. So we have to work through it. It's going to be hard, but we're going to do it. So to begin our lecture, I didn't actually have a very great painting or image that I could really think about. for this last lecture. I just have this one image here. This is actually a globe, and of course, as you can tell, it's an image of a globe of America, and it's in Ukrainian. And when I first arrived to Mariupol in September, I didn't have an apartment, so I was staying at a colleague's friend's place. And I don't know, everything was just so new and different for me. And I look on the globe and I'm like, oh, wow, that's what America looks like to in Ukrainian language. I didn't even know, what United States of America was in Ukrainian. That's how ignorant I was of Ukrainian, to be honest. Um, and I looked on the globe and it shocked me because I thought, oh, there's New Orleans. That's my city. I can find it right here. And then I was thinking, how sad is it that, and I think most of my students that I've met and colleagues and friends, they know where I am, they know where I live. But I'll be honest, the average American doesn't know where Ukraine is. And they certainly don't know where Mariupol is. Um, and yet, so many Ukrainians know about America, and they know about, other cities in America. So, as much as I wanted to give this lecture for you all, I hope to do an equal amount of education on my part about Ukraine, and more importantly, educating other Americans about Ukraine, because you know where we are. America's been, loud and bright on the, news and television screens, but no one really thinks about Ukraine. I mean, and they recently did because of the scandal, but it was because of a scandal, with Trump and Zelensky. So I just think that's an interesting image in terms of, I could, there's my city, but I couldn't find Mariupol on a map at first. Later Googled it and I found it. But I didn't know off the bat. I didn't know offhand, and it's something that Americans need to work on. And we are, like, I will say, for as pessimistic as I can be, I think many, especially young Americans, are very global minded. They're not honestly as ignorant as maybe older generations. They want to learn about other countries. They're not fixated or caught in the Cold War era mentality, thank goodness, in my opinion. So it's changing for the better. Globalization is not all bad. I'll say that. Oh, let me move on to my next slide. So to just go over our lecture 6 key points. So last lecture was very long, I know, but we were covering 4 major decades in America, probably some of the most important decades in all of American history, to be honest. And we had 4 major kind of themes going on. We had our continued containment policy in American foreign policy. As you all know, we were afraid of communism's spread. So we took a lot of measures, both known and unknown, to try to contain it. And a lot of it was through money, giving just funding. A lot of it was through foreign invasions, and not always for the best, to be honest. And it started with the Korean War, and it went through Vietnam, most notably. We also had CIA operations that were not really known to the American public. So we're working a lot behind the scenes to try to weaken communism or to try to destabilize any communist forces from taking power. And of course, as part of that containment, we have a lot of foreign interventions. And the big one that is a big toll and price on America is the Vietnam War. And this has a toll on America, not only for the lives that are lost. Thousands of young American soldiers, innocent soldiers, were killed, as well as Vietnamese civilians and soldiers were killed. But it also it had a major effect on the American cultural psyche. We start to feel a lot of anger and a lot of apathy. We don't feel good about our country, basically. And people are questioning, why are we in Vietnam? Why are we in these other countries? And some Americans really feeling like, the world is on fire. Things are changing for good and for bad. And part of this tumultuous times has to do with, there's a lot of civil rights movements, civil rights protests, particularly against the Vietnam War, as well as for desegregation. There were many, honestly, white Americans who didn't like desegregation. They wanted to have segregation still. But there were also Americans who wanted just greater equality. A lot of Latino Americans, Native Americans, women who are American, They want greater equity and equality. So you're seeing a lot of changes in American laws and society. It's all coming together in like 1 or 2 decades, really. And, as we have this kind of anger and this malaise, I would say, we also start to have a feeling of optimism in the 80s. And this is how Reagan really won his presidency and why he was so popular. He was, all about making America great, which was his original idea, not Trump's actually. He said, let's make America great. And that comes from Reagan. And he felt like Americans shouldn't be embarrassed or upset about their country. They should feel great. We have some great moral values, so to speak. So let's go back to that era. Let's go back to something like the 1950s, to be honest. Like any decade, there's good and bad. So, but that's where we are. We have this period of anger and malaise, and then we're starting to move into optimism in the 80s. And that optimism just grows in the 90s. And a big reason for that optimism is because of the end of the Cold War. And I put quotes, end of the Cold War, because I personally believe that the Cold War never ended. If you look at US Russian relations, you'll notice that, we still see each other very much as adversaries. Whether that's justified or not, it almost doesn't matter. I think it's really a consequence of the Cold War that we still never got rid of that mentality in our foreign policy. And part of it is also, I would say, Russia also never acknowledged the end of the Cold War. I think personally, this is my opinion, I think Vladimir Putin still never could quite accept, the Soviet Union's downfall, because the Soviet Union's downfall meant Russia's downfall. And he very much wants to be like a strong man. So that's another reason why I think the Cold War, quote, never ended. It's not only from the US's end, it's also from Russia's end, especially under Vladimir Putin. But anyway, so in American culture, we don't have an exact point of when the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, there is that technical date, I believe it's December 25th, 1991, when the Soviet Union's flag comes down from the White House in Russia, I believe. And just forgive me, everyone. My knowledge of the end of the Cold War is not very strong. I am not a Russophile. I'm not a Cold War maniac in the terms of, I don't love studying the Cold War. It's actually my least favorite period in American history. And I'm not into like Russian history. I know it in part because I was born in it and because I'm an American and you always know something about Russia. But I'm not very experienced or specialized in it. But I will try, of course, to speak about it because it's still very important. But anyway, so I believe the end of the Soviet Union, at least officially, is December 25th, 1991. You can correct me if I'm wrong, guys. It's no problem. You can comment and say, no, it's this. So, but I will say in terms of American psyche and Americans' minds, we start to think of the end of the Cold War with the slow destruction of the Berlin Wall. And that was very symbolic, of course. The Berlin Wall separated East and West Berlin, and it kind of symbolized the larger split in Germany that was almost for 30 years. And when we start to see the, Berliners, I believe East Berliners start to chip down the wall as well as the West Berliners, it's like, oh, wow, what's going on? They're taking matters into their own hands. And we were, of course, very supportive of the destruction of the Berlin Wall because we saw it as a big symbolism of the Iron Curtain. And also, a lot of people died trying to escape from East Berlin into West Berlin, and also from East Germany to West Germany. It's also a horrific sight in that way. So I know from my mom, I asked her too, like, where do you sort of see the beginning of the end of the Cold War? She said, well, it kind of starts for us with the Berlin Wall. But, like my mom and other Americans, they can't really point to a specific time period. It's kind of just all unraveled within a period of, a couple of years. So anyway, the Berlin Wall starts to collapse and it's like, oh, wow, what's going on? And of course, we have Gorbachev, who you all, and I know I mispronounced his name. I know I did. I think it's Gorbachev. Sorry. But we say Gorbachev. I know he starts to have his glasnost and perestroika, which was also a big part of, why the Soviet Union starts to change and maybe unravel. Of course, Chernobyl doesn't help. Chernobyl was a couple years before, in April 1986. That really, I think morally and mentally starts to, chip away at the Soviet Union's quote unquote superiority. It's like this horrific accident that happens that then the Soviet Union try to cover up, try to deny. It's just they couldn't do it, and it was kind of they just fell flat on their face, I would say, in that regard. And I did watch that documentary, Chernobyl, on HBO. It was really good. So anyway, so we start to say the Berlin Wall's the end of the Cold War. Of course, you have Poland's election a few months earlier. That was also a big monumental change. They elect a non-communist opposition government. And what was so symbolic about that is the Soviet Union didn't roll in their tanks when that happened. So this is where I think other countries too, and again, please feel free to comment or ask questions about this, because I don't know the end of the Cold War from the Soviet Union's perspective. I only know it from the American perspective. But this was, I heard or read about, was a monumental change, because it's when a government that is part of the Soviet spheres of influence votes for a non-communist regime, and the Soviet Union doesn't roll in their tanks. So that was very monumental. But while this is going on, while there seems to be big changes going on in the Soviet Union, we have our president, George H.W. Bush. He is actually quiet during this time mostly. He doesn't really speak out. He doesn't make a speech like Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He's more cautious, because I think part of it is he wants to just see what happens. He's not going to intervene. He's just going to see, how does the Soviet Union handle this? Maybe it doesn't, and maybe it will unravel in a peaceful way. But he's cautious, and time will tell whether that was really a good decision or not. I'm not sure. But something that is important, like starting in September of 1990, excuse me, it should be 1990. He does say that a new world order is starting to rise. And, that phrase, which I heard isn't even originally his, that phrase means a lot of things. Well, what's the new world order? Is it America? Is it a collapse of the Cold War and not having two rivals go after each other? Is the new world order the UN and international diplomacy? It can mean lots of things. And his speech, he was kind of broad, Bush, when he said that. But part of his speech was really emphasizing that there's a new world, new world relations, so to speak. And only time will tell, and the US will tell, what will that look like. And I think Bush was actually optimistic about his phrase. He wanted to mean like, no longer do we have the Cold War, we can do international diplomacy. We can maybe have better agreements, more international peace. Because even though he was a conservative and a Republican, Bush was also formerly the ambassador to the United Nations. He understood the United Nations well. So I think he was optimistic about it. And as I said, Americans, like my mom, and I asked her to, because she was obviously alive during the end of the Cold War, she was shocked by the collapse, like many Americans, but it was also a feeling of optimism. And the optimism isn't necessarily, oh, America won. I mean, yes, you're going to have some Americans who claim that, oh, America beat the Soviet Union. I think more of the optimism was that, okay, we can turn the page now. We don't have to keep going at it in this weird espionage, backhanded deals, foreign interventions. I think part of the optimism was like, okay, let's start something fresh. Let's start something new. But it was a shock, I will say. It was a shock for many Americans. They were not expecting the collapse of the Soviet Union. No one could have predicted it. And this is a picture of the Berlin Wall. I was there in March 2015, and it's very beautiful. And I'm glad that they kept parts of it. The German government kept parts of it. This is just one of the many murals on it. And it's kind of just the lives that are stuck between the walls, because, there were families who were separated and torn apart by the wall. They couldn't see their loved ones. Some died trying to escape, some died trying to see their family and friends. So I think it's a very beautiful mural. It's not the best picture I know, but I was actually in a bus when I took it. Okay, just a little bit about Bush Sr. He's not really well known, even in American culture. I mean, people know him, but they don't really know a ton about him. People, know a few things, like a couple of things, but he is famous in part because his son was also the president. But George or Herbert Walker Bush, he's George H.W. Bush, and his son is George W. Bush, in case you weren't confused enough. He was born in Massachusetts in 1924. He attended Phillips Academy, which is a very prestigious academy in New England. I don't know where, maybe New Hampshire. I don't know, to be honest, but it's a very famous, prestigious high school because it's a well-known school for like feeding students into Ivy Leagues, into Harvard, into Yale, into Princeton. But he was kind of remarkable after high school. Instead of going to college, he joined the Navy during World War II, and he was actually one of the youngest fighter pilots, if not the youngest fighter pilot ever at the time in the Navy. He was like 18 when he became a fighter pilot, and he, got stars and medals for it. After the war, he gets married and he attends Yale University, and which I believe his father did too, Prescott Bush. But anyway, he then moves to Texas to work in the oil industry. I'm not sure why, but that's what he does, and it's interesting because people sometimes, at least I forget that he's from New England. I think of George Sr. or Bush Sr., excuse me, as a Texas man, but he really got his upbringing in New England. He's a Yankee, actually, which is weird to think about because his son, George W. Bush, very much epitomizes a Texas man. Texan, they say. But as you know, Bush Sr. is the father of George W. Bush. He's also the father of Jeb Bush, or John Bush. That's his other son's name. Both of his two sons became very famous politicians. George W. Bush became governor of Texas and then the president, and Jeb Bush became the governor of Florida. And his name is Jeb because that's his initials. I think his name is John Ellis Bush, so they called him Jeb. He also has other children. You just don't really hear about them much, which kind of stinks, but those are the two most famous of his kids. He served 2 terms as a representative from Texas, and he ran unsuccessfully for the Senate. So he actually doesn't have a whole lot of political experience from Congress, but he has a lot of experience in other ways. He was appointed to ambassador to the United Nations, and then he was a director of Central Intelligence, the CIA. So, not a shabby record. And he served as President Reagan's vice president, and then he's elected to presidency in 1988. And as you all know, this is very confusing, I find. But we elect our presidents in November, but they don't officially start their term till January, a couple months later. So and that's why we have to put it as like 1989 to 1993. So anyway, and he did, as we would say, witness the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. And I would say the establishment of new nations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I put new in quotation marks because, as I know, Ukraine is not a new nation. It's always been there. It's just been overtaken and, ruled by other foreign empires. But I know that these nations, like Belarus, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, they've been nations before. So that's why I say new. But so he witnessed a very monumental moment in American history and world history. But interesting enough, he was kind of quiet about it. It's not to say he was weak about it. He was just quiet. He did continue American interventions abroad in Panama and most notably in the Persian Gulf. So again, even though we have the end of the Cold War, so to speak, we don't end our foreign interventions. And when we start to do new foreign interventions, they come for different reasons. In the Persian Gulf, it was primarily because of Saddam Hussein and oil, to be honest. Panama, I believe, was because of their communist ruling party or communist takeover. That was, I believe, for communists. reasons. But anyway, unfortunately he only lasted for 4 years as president because he still dealt with a very declining economy. There was still increased crime during this time period. You actually had the Rodney King riots when a black man was beaten almost to death. He lives actually. He was almost beaten to death in Los Angeles in 1992, and someone caught it on videotape. This is before the era of cell phones. Oh my God. But someone caught it on video, and it exploded all over the news, and you had huge riots in LA, particularly from Black Americans, because they were just so angered and disgusted by, just the overall escalation of police violence against Black Americans. So he had to deal with that. There was also actually higher federal spending. As I said with Reagan, even though he wanted to cut taxes and decrease the size of the government, there's one area that Republicans are okay with increasing the budget for, and that has always been for the military. It's the one exception that they're willing to do. So in that sense, they're not really conservative in that way. They just strongly believe in a very large and powerful military. And so that continues with Bush, and it continued with his son, George W. Bush, and it continues under Trump. And it also continued under Clinton and Obama. This is one of the few areas generally where Democrats and Republicans agree on. They agree with a very large, powerful military for the US. It's like the one exception when it comes to federal spending. And so because of the higher federal spending, the declining economy, he actually had to raise taxes, even though his big promise during his presidential campaign was, he said famously, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So, but he did raise taxes. So, and I will say he did pass away a couple of years ago in November 2018. So he is no longer living with us. And actually, as far as I know, the living presidents right now, the oldest living president is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is 95. He is alive. And this is Bush here. He's meeting with troops in Saudi Arabia. We'll go over why. This is a famous image of him, greeting them. And this is President Bush with Secretary Gorbachev. They had good relations as far as I know. They weren't, I think Bush and Gorbachev saw this possibility of a new relationship between the US and the USSR. And this is maybe why Bush was cautious in the sense he wasn't outwardly he never outwardly say, "I want the end of the USSR," because he knew if you get rid of the USSR, you might have very big instability. And I think he also wanted to work with Gorbachev to slowly open up the USSR to, a more capitalist market-based economy. So I think he just saw it as a new possibility with Gorbachev. Maybe we can have new relations with the Soviet Union. It doesn't have to end, but we can start something new. And this is the two of them in 1991 during the START Treaty. And something I have to mention about Bush, no one actually really knows this. But he did make this, maybe you all know it, but in America, people don't really know about the speech. At least I've never heard of it till I started researching about Bush. But he made this famous Chicken Kyiv speech. It was just one of the worst speeches you can make as a president, I think. And it was kind of like a slap in the face to Ukraine. He later regrets it. Bush later regrets saying the words that he did. But it kind of does give you a picture of how he was thinking, unfortunately, about the Soviet Union's collapse and about Ukraine. But I'll just give you a timeline. The United States did officially recognize, I put December 25th. I don't know if that's correct. But we did officially recognize Ukrainian independence when Ukraine declared Ukraine declared independence in August. But I think once the Soviet Union collapsed and ended, after that ended, then we officially opened up recognition to all post-Soviet states, one being, of course, Ukraine. And we upgraded our consulate in Kyiv to embassy in January of 1992. So 1 month later, we go from a consulate to an embassy in Kyiv. But prior to Ukraine's official declaration of independence in late August of 1991, George Bush decided to give a speech in front of the Ukrainian Congress, Verkhovna Rada. you'll have to forgive me, I have terrible pronunciation, but the Ukrainian parliament, he gives a speech. And for some reason, he basically, this is what he says. He says, Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based on ethnic hatred. So he said this because even though I think he supported Ukrainian independence, he didn't support it if it was violent or it meant, you know, another almost a despotism or tyranny overtaking another one. He basically believed that Ukraine was being overtaken by maybe something like a despot, um, and he thought it was a bad idea. And he thought it was basically why Ukraine was declaring independence was based on ethnic history and hatred. I don't know, but it's just a poor speech. But I just wanted to point it out to you because it is something he did. And I think it does illustrate a little bit of his mentality with the USSR in that I don't think Bush really wanted it's not that he didn't want to keep the USSR alive, but he was, I think, very cautious and scared about what would happen if this entire vast empire, so to speak, collapses. Then you'll have local ethnic hatred, maybe there'll be fighting, maybe even more wars. Might you get people who are more despotic or tyrannical than Gorbachev? Like, he was basically kind of fearful of the unknown. And I think his Chicken Kyiv speech really exemplifies that. So, and this is when he had it. He had it August 1st when he made the speech, and he's shaking hands with then Chairman Leonid Kravchuk. He's then the chairman and the later president, as you all know. So, but anyway, and I do need to mention this a little bit. We do have also under Bush another war. And this is an interesting war because it kind of exemplifies maybe America's new war policy or mentality. We start to no longer have wars based on political reasons. We start to do it in part because of strategic national resources interests, so to speak. And this really plays a part in the war on terror, I would say, or at least with the war in Iraq. But anyway, in the 1990, Iraq invaded its neighboring country, Kuwait, a tiny little country in the south of Iraq. And this worried the US for two main reasons. First, Kuwait had a large oil reserve, and it was next to Saudi Arabia, which also had a massive oil reserve. And the US was afraid that if Iraq took over Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, then Iraq would have almost a fifth of the world oil supply. And that's a vast amount of oil. That's a vast amount of money. And who knows what Saddam Hussein will buy with that. At this time, the US really believes that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, whatever that really means. I think it's kind of a broad term for, non-nuclear weapons that can have a lot of impact on over a large area of land, so to speak, in terms of its explosion. But anyway, the US is afraid of that. And the US is also afraid of Iraq because Iraq at the time had the fourth largest military in the world. Ironically, because the US sold a lot of weapons and technology to Iraq 10 years prior in the Iranian-Iraq war. And this is where I really get angry because, things that we do 10 years prior or in the past come back to haunt us in the future. And we'll see this later too with the Afghan war, the war in Afghanistan. So we're afraid for the oil reserves. We're also afraid of Saddam Hussein obtaining even more power and having an even larger military, powerful military. So the US, before the war, the US actually sent around 500,000 troops into Saudi Arabia. This is called Operation Desert Shield. And it's, kind of a defense, getting ready to invade. And so to make sure Saddam knows that, hey, if you step into Saudi Arabia, we got American troops here to fight you. And the US issued an ultimatum to Iraq. And it basically said, leave Kuwait by January 15th, 1991, or face a full attack. And when the date arrived and Saddam Hussein didn't leave, he didn't surrender, the US bombed basically and attacked Iraq. And it was primarily an aerial bombing campaign. Yes, we had troops on the ground, but one of the things that the first Persian Gulf War, that this is what we call it, the Gulf War or the Persian Gulf War, one of the things that this war is really well known for is for our aerial attacks, our airplane attacks. We have, quite frankly, due to the 1980s and our investment in the military, we have a very good military. I would say a superior one compared to Iraq. And this is really a testament to our military technology and our supplies, too, I would say, and our prowess, our ability to win and fight. The war, so to speak, only lasts for 43 days, and it's called Operation Desert Storm. Once we invade or once we start to attack Iraq, then it's called Operation Desert Storm. And it's a very quick war. And technically, I will just say this, it's not technically a war. In fact, the US hasn't technically been in a war since World War II, because a war has to be declared and approved by Congress. And all the wars that we've been in, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf War, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, all those wars are technically operations, military operations that are largely controlled and governed by the president and that are funded by the Congress. But they're not legally speaking wars. It's a little weird. And that's how we kind of get around things too, because, it's a way for the president to kind of declare war without having to go through Congress. He or she still needs to get funding from Congress, but Congress generally goes with the president. So that's just a fun fact. It's not fun, but it's an interesting fact. We actually haven't declared war since World War II. We've had military operations, but not a war, so to speak, legally speaking. So moving on from Bush to Slick Willie, William Clinton. Slick Willie is not a nice nickname, but it is a nickname I heard about Bill Clinton, in part because of his indiscretions with Monica Lewinsky. But he is more famously known as Bill Clinton. And he is a Democratic president that serves 2 terms. And his full name is William Jefferson Clinton. And he was born in August 1946 in Arkansas. So that's kind of different. He's one of the Southern governors, Southern presidents like Jimmy Carter. And when he was growing up, he famously played the saxophone. And I know he often says this, but he met President John Kennedy in high school, which was like one of the most monumental moments in his life. And it inspired him to run for office later on. So he met John Kennedy, which is cool. He attended university and law school. I believe he attended Georgetown University in DC and then Yale Law School. He became a lawyer and later attorney general in Arkansas. He did marry in this time period of school and becoming attorney general. He married Hillary Clinton, his wife, and they have a daughter, one child, Chelsea Clinton. And everybody knows Hillary Clinton. I mean, this is one of those couples where people know the husband and the wife very well. And he was governor of Arkansas in 1979, and then he was reelected in 1983 up until 1992. And he was one of the youngest governors ever elected to governor in Arkansas. Because I think he has a, even if you don't like his policies, he is a very dynamic speaker, kind of like Obama. He's just well spoken. He knows how to be in front of a crowd. He knows how to get people excited. And in 1993, he beats George Bush for the presidency, and Al Gore is his vice president. And I would say that his presidency, except for Monica Lewinsky, really, was generally good. Generally, he has some low moments in his presidency, but he has a successful one in the sense that he has a very good economy. And his political strategist, James Carville, famously said during his presidential campaign, "It's the economy, stupid." And it's true, to be honest. I think, what really gives, in terms of political opponents or whoever can win in the presidency, is the one who really has the best economic plans, or it's not even always the best economic plans. It's who it's who people think will lead America to a better economy. I think that's a really big reason why Trump won, among other reasons. But a lot of, especially Republicans, believe that Trump had the better possibility or capability to bring America into a better economy than Hillary Clinton. And it goes back to that famous phrase, it's the economy, stupid. And I agree for the most part, actually. Economy is number one in American minds in terms of who they want for presidency. But during his presidency, Bill Clinton's presidency, he had the lowest unemployment rate. He had low inflation. He had reduced crime, even though he continued the war on drugs that was continued from Nixon to Reagan to Bush. He also actually sent a lot of Black and Brown Americans into jail. It's the continuation of mass incarceration in America, unfortunately. He also did this three strikes rule. Like, if you commit 3 crimes, then you go to jail. Misdemeanor crimes, then you go to jail. A very controversial and not a favored policy anymore. So he's good and bad in that way. But under his presidency, for the first time, probably since like the 1920s or teens, America has a budget surplus. We balance the budget and we have an extra amount of cash. This hasn't happened since then, to be honest. We've had a huge budget deficit now. One thing that he's also known for in his presidency, especially with Hillary, his wife, is that they tried to pass a large healthcare reform bill, but it failed. And to be honest, healthcare reform is like the one point in American society that is really hard to pass, very controversial, because it's not just like, oh, Americans don't want health reform. I think many Americans actually do, but it's a matter of what will it look like and how do you deal with the insurance companies and people who like their private insurance companies and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. It's a big, big web. And when you try to change it, it just gets very tangled, it's very difficult. And one thing he also did during his presidency with the fall of Yugoslavia, also, you had a lot of ethnic clashes. There's a lot of infighting, between Serbia. You had Kosovo later, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro. That area that was former Yugoslavia has a lot of ethnic violence. And so he actually sent forces as part of a UN peacekeeping mission. He sent forces to Bosnia. And he also authorized the bombing of Iraq when Saddam Hussein barred the UN for inspections. And this is actually one of the reasons why later on the Bush administration would claim that Saddam Hussein was hiding or producing secretly weapons of mass destructions, because Saddam Hussein wouldn't allow the UN to inspect its country. He was impeached. He was acquitted later by, I believe, the Senate, but he was impeached by the House for his relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. It happened in 1998, and he's the second only president. I should actually say the third only president, excuse me. At the time, he was the second only president to be impeached. The other was Nixon. Now it's Trump. So it's Nixon, Clinton, and Trump, who are the only 3 presidents to be impeached. But like Trump, he was acquitted or found, so to speak, not guilty by the Senate. Regardless of what you think of his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, it happened, and it's something he'll always be known for, and it's why he has the nickname Slick Willie. But other than that, I will say Bill Clinton is generally well regarded. He is, at least, especially among Democrats. He was kind of seen as a popular young president. He was even featured on this TV show that I used to love when I was younger. It was in the 90s. It was called The Animaniacs. It was a cartoon show. It was actually produced, I think, by Steven Spielberg. but he was in the intro song, the theme song, and this is Bill Clinton. He's playing on his sax. As you know, he's famous for playing the sax. So yeah, he was, I think he was a dynamic leader in that he was happy and willing to be um, on the television in popular culture. He's different from George H. Walker Bush in that way. And during Clinton's presidency, we have the Budapest memorandum, uh, and you all know this very well, obviously. But as you know, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. This scared the U.S. along with Russia as well. This country has the third largest nuclear arsenal. What happens when the Soviet Union collapses? Who will take control of this nuclear arsenal? Yada yada. People were just scared, especially the U.S. And out of fear of this nuclear possession that might lead into a war or instability, maybe it will fall into the wrong hands. The United States, along with Britain and Russia and Ukraine, as well as other nations, I believe Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Belarus, no, I believe it's Kazakhstan and Belarus, they signed the Budapest Memorandum on December 5th, 1994. And it's a memorandum. And that's unfortunate in the regard that it has no legal obligations on the parties. So this is one of the reasons why kind of Vladimir Putin was able to get with breaking the memorandum and invading Crimea and invading eastern Ukraine, is because he wasn't legally binded, so to speak. Doesn't mean what he did was right. It was completely wrong and horrible. And of course, Russia also justifies its breakage of the Budapest Memorandum with saying that at the time of its signing, Ukraine was a different government. And because of the Orange Revolution, I believe, and the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine has a different government. So the memorandum doesn't hold up. I don't know. It's honestly a BS excuse to invade Ukraine. But anyway, they did it. And it's a big stain, I think, on America's character, I would say, and its foreign policy. The fact that we promised Ukraine and other nations to back them and to defend them, but we don't. And even in the memorandum, it's what it says is that basically, Washington and Moscow, America, Britain, and Russia have to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. And they also have to refrain from the threat or use of force against these countries, specifically Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And when Russia did invade Ukraine and took over Crimea, John Kerry did meet with the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, William Hague, and he met with the acting Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Andrei Deshutsia. Excuse me, guys. I'm really bad at pronunciation. He did meet with them and he spoke, but, honestly, it's been lip service, we say. Lip service. It's just kind of all talk and not much action. But, I don't know if it's better than the U.S. not saying anything, but Kerry did say he supports Ukraine, and he did believe that the U.S. Must cooperate and work with the international community to fight on behalf of Ukraine. Like, this is where I would say U.S. foreign policy, especially under Obama and Trump even, is very different from Bush and even Clinton, especially George Bush, I would say, George Bush Jr., the son. It's very different in that, Obama and his administration really believe that the U.S. should not dictate another country's foreign policy and that it should not do any foreign interventions or moves without the international community's consent. Unfortunately, I think that's not always the best because maybe the international community is slow, and at times the international community is beholden to Russia. Things can't get passed in the UN without Russia's approval or China's approval or the US or France or Britain's approval. And that's not always a good thing, It kind of makes the UN a little bit weak, I would say. But, we won't go into that. But anyway, this is the famous Budapest Memorandum, and it was under Clinton's administration. And we have pictures here of Yeltsin, Clinton, and Kuchma. They're signing the memorandum. But moving on to W, as he's known, actually, you can say Bush. People generally think, oh, you probably mean George Bush, Jr., but people call him W or W. That's like the slang of W, the letter W. He was president during a very epic moment in American history, I would say. He served 2 terms. So George W. Bush, he was born in Connecticut. Again, I always think of him as a Texas man. And the reason why is because even though he is born in Connecticut, he did grow up in Texas. And he was later governor of Texas. Like his father, he attended Yale. And later he received a business degree from Harvard. But like his father, he also entered the oil industry in Texas. He married a school teacher, Laura Bush. And they had 2 daughters, I believe, Jenna and Barbara Bush. And one of his daughters, Jenna Bush, is now a famous news anchor. I don't know, TV personality. She's on the Today Show, I believe, which is a show that covers politics, but also culture and American life. I don't know what to call that. But anyway, she's actually well known in that regard. People see her on TV. But anyway, so George Bush became governor of Texas in 1995. And then 5 years later, he runs for president in 2000. And he runs against Vice President Al Gore. And this was a very famous election because it was so close. And in fact, this is also another case of where the candidate who loses, which is Al Gore, actually had more popular votes. More people voted for Al Gore during this election than Bush. But because of our electoral college system in America, George Bush won. This happened again with Trump and Hillary. Trump didn't win the popular vote, but he won the electoral college vote. And that is a whole nother topic and lecture, guys. But anyway, it was a very close election, so close that the Supreme Court had to decide basically the outcome. And it was decided because Florida, they had an issue with their voting and how they were counting the votes. And people weren't sure, do they get to count their paper ballots or their electronic ballots, something like that. But anyway, the Supreme Court essentially decided the outcome and ruled that George Bush wins the electoral college vote and that he becomes president. So he starts off with a very controversial beginning, so to speak. Something to note, he is actually the second only president whose father was also president. The other one was John Adams, who was oh gosh, forgive me, guys. I think he's the second president of America. John Adams was the second president. And then John Quincy Adams was his son. And I think his son was like, oh dear me, like the 12th or 13th president of America, early 1800s. I'm terrible at this. I don't know this time period very well, John Quincy Adams. But anyway, it hasn't happened often in American history. And something to note about his presidency, of course, is 9 months after he begins his presidency, we have 9/11, when 2 airplanes fly into the World Trade Center. And it's actually not just those 2 airplanes, it's also an airplane that flies into the Pentagon, and it's one that lands in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So, but this is the moment of 9/11. And I will say after 9/11, whatever Bush had in mind for his presidency is kind of put on the back end, because he really has to figure out what is America going to do in response to 9/11. This was completely new for any American president. In fact, I would say it's the only moment that comes close to this, like, oh my God moment in American history is Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor naval base during World War II and got us into the World War. This was like, another one of those like shocking moments, like someone coming into our country and invading, so to speak. It wasn't an invasion, but it was still a foreign attack, so to speak, a foreign based attack. But it was shocking. And, in response, Bush declared a war on terror, a really broad term that I don't really know what it means, so to speak, exactly. What is terrorism exactly? Is it only internationalism? Is the KKK terrorism? And if so, why aren't we fighting them? Things like that. It's kind of like the war on drugs. No one really knows what the war on drug means or what its specific goals or outcomes are, but it's a general term against a social ill or policy. And here, war on terror is about a war against international terrorism. But, what does that really mean? Does that mean we're going to fight every international terrorist group? I mean, that's a lot. Are we going to fight all those who hate America? Unfortunately, that's also a lot. It gets tricky, actually. But we also, in response to the war on terror, we send U.S. forces into Afghanistan, and we later send them into Iraq in response to this war on terror outcry. Something that George Bush did is he did try to reform the education system. He had a very famous policy, No Child Left Behind. It is now controversial because the No Child Left Behind policy basically gave better grants or more grants and federal funding to schools, but it was based on certain test scores and certain measurable outcomes. And many people have criticized this because, with education, it's not always a good thing that everything is measurable, everything is quantified, because education isn't only about scores, right? And, there can be a good teacher who might not score well, so to speak, or there might be a smart student, but they're just not good at standardized tests. I was one of those people, actually. I'm horrible at standardized tests. But I don't think of myself as a dumb student. I'm really bad at multiple choice, sit on your butt and take the test kind of test. So anyway, it's a controversial policy. Many people now criticize it, to be honest, but it was a big deal when he passed it. He also dealt with, I don't go into this, but it's very personal for me. He dealt with Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina happened in August of 2005. It was very personal because my house also flooded and was affected by this big hurricane. And in terms of American culture, Hurricane Katrina, it's not only seen as like an epic national disaster, it's seen as an epic governmental disaster. People criticize President Bush for his response, but they also criticize FEMA, which is our federal emergency management agency. It's basically the agency that deals with emergency crises like this, like hurricanes. And people criticize FEMA's response under Michael Brown. They criticize our governor's response, Kathleen Blanco's response, and they even criticize New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin's response. And in my opinion, Hurricane Katrina really exposed two failures: the failures of adequately protecting and caring about Black Americans in New Orleans. This was a big racial exposure in terms of like the majority of people affected during Katrina were poor Black Americans. And that was quite honestly on purpose. Not that the hurricane purposely affected them or attacked them. It's that we have a levee system, which is a barrier system to protect New Orleans. And that barrier system was not adequately maintained or upheld by our local, state, and federal government. And part of that is because the levee system only protected very wealthy parts of America, but it was also run down and not well protected around the poor parts of New Orleans. So Black Americans were predominantly affected over wealthy white Americans in New Orleans. It was a big racial problem in that regard. And of course, as I said, it was a big federal response problem. Like, it was a mess up from the federal level, the local level, and the state level. Like, it was a failure, in my opinion, on all levels of government, an absolute failure. No one person is to blame for Hurricane Katrina's awful response, like our response to Hurricane Katrina. It's a mixture of people. And one of those people, in my opinion, is Bush. He didn't do a very good job taking the reins and really saying, this is what the federal government will do. It was kind of like just one big mess. Like, who's going to work on this? Who's going to do what? That's my personal opinion, because that's just my personal feelings toward it as someone who was a victim of Hurricane Katrina. I will also say too, I just want to recommend the movie When the Levees Broke by Spike Lee. It's a very long documentary series, but it's excellent. I don't like to watch things about Hurricane Katrina, but this was the best one. I think he did the best job, Spike Lee, in his movie When the Levees Broke. He did a really good job really trying to understand the failures of the levees and the failures of protecting and helping Black Americans after Hurricane Katrina. Why were they most affected? So I recommend that. At the end of his presidency, of George Bush's presidency, the US does have a horrible recession. We had the 2008 recession. So, and I would not say that's Bush's fault, so to speak. The recession happens for a variety of reasons. Maybe it is Bush administration's fault because they didn't have enough economic regulations, but there are many reasons why it happened, predominantly because of subprime mortgages, I believe, the housing bubble. You had a lot of loans that shouldn't have been given out, I believe, by companies. So anyway, it was just a horrible recession, and it happens at the end of his presidency. And here I have a picture of Bush famously speaking with a New York fighter on September 14th. A couple of days later, he visits Ground Zero, and he visits the aftermath of 9/11, or the World Trade Center in New York. And this is him famously looking out of the Air Force One airplane after Hurricane Katrina hits. He's looking out onto the destruction. So. And I do have to talk a little bit about 9/11. It is I would say, honestly, the defining moment so far of America in the 21st century. You know, in terms of being like one of the most epic events to happen, this is it, in my opinion. And there's a myriad of reasons for that, but it was just, part of it was really the shock factor. This was, in some ways, this was not like Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor happened during a war. This was, quote unquote, during peacetime, and we had these international terrorists attacking America. And so, as you all know, 9/11, it happened on September 11th. That's why we always call it 9/11. It happened in 2001. 19 militants, I would say, people who were associated with Al Qaeda. They were from Saudi Arabia. They were working with Osama bin Laden and other Al Qaeda leaders. They hijacked 4 airplanes. There were 4 airplanes they hijacked, and they carried out suicide attacks against certain buildings and places in the United States. So 2 planes were flown, as you all know, into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And the World Trade Center, symbolized the financial capital of America, especially being in New York City. They then hit the Pentagon. One of the planes hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the Pentagon is where the military headquarters are, basically. It's where the Department of Defense is, and the Department of Defense is the overall department of the military. So they hit the financial center and they hit the military center of America. And then a 4th plane, which no one really knows where it was going to, but some people speculate maybe the White House, maybe Congress, for the political center. But there was a plane that was going towards DC. And amazingly enough, the people who were on this plane knew what was going on. And what they decided to do is they went after the hijackers in the plane. And it's famously known as Flight 93. And these passengers attacked the hijackers so that they couldn't crash into the White House or Congress. And unfortunately, all the passengers died, as well as the hijackers. So, maybe more destruction could have happened to another, American building or landmark, but it didn't because of these brave passengers. And in all, during 9/11, during these four planes hitting different areas of America, about 3,000 people died, if not more, I believe, actually. There's no exact number because sometimes you also have casualty as a result of the burning or as a result of a building collapsing. But at least with the World Trade Center, over 78 countries were represented, at least from the victims from the World Trade Center. So this was, I think, another reason why 9/11 was so monumental in that it didn't just feel like an attack on America, it felt like an attack on the world. Because you had, especially in the World Trade Center, a lot of, different international people working. And it's one of the reasons why, in response to 9/11, we have such an international coalition. Um, and as I've said before, Bush, in response to 9/11, he does start a new war on terror. And part of that has to do with creating a new agency. It's a brand new federal agency. It's called the Department of Homeland Security. And we start to initiate a lot of new security rules in airports and at borders. We also created Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. It's not a prison because technically it's just to hold people not captive, but to hold them before they have their trial. We don't call it a prison because if it was a prison, we'd have to abide by international law. So we call it a detention center, kind of like an immigration detention center. And it's in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And to be honest, it's very controversial even today in terms of, do we have it? Do we not have it? What are the rules in Guantanamo Bay? Are you allowed to torture or not, so to speak? And of course, we have the larger fight of international terrorism, not just against Al Qaeda, but even today we declare a war on ISIS, in terms of international terrorism. And these are two famous images from 9/11. This is the one on the left is the most famous, I would say. I remember seeing this when 9/11 happened. These were New York firefighters. They were hosting a flag over Ground Zero. We call it Ground Zero, the area where the two towers fell. And it's a very, of course, patriotic, symbolic photograph. It kind of reminds you of the photo in the Battle of Iwo Jima. This was a famous battle in World War II where the American Marines are slowly hoisting up an American flag. It's a very famous image. So I think this is another reason why this is so reminiscent. It kind of parallels that image. Another one that I personally really like in terms of its symbolism, but not even symbolism, but its uniqueness is this is a famous photograph called The Falling Man. It was published in the New York Times, page 7, I believe, after 9/11. It was very controversial. A lot of people thought it was inappropriate, in part because you're witnessing a man falling off the Trade Center towards his death. I mean, he's going to die. And at the time when the photograph was taken by Richard Drew, they didn't know who the man was. So this was kind of an anonymous man falling. Later, it turns out it's Jonathan Briley. There is something very, I have to say, beautiful about the image. It's not because it's beautiful because he's dying. It's beautiful in that, it's this moment and the stillness of a man leaping to death, and he's parallel with the tower. I don't know. There's something. It's a stillness that you see that when 9/11 happened, everything was happening so quickly. People were panicking, rightfully so. They were crying. They were trying to leave New York. The firefighters were trying to get everyone out of the World Trade Center. And then when they collapsed, they tried to find people amidst the rubble, the destruction. So in the midst of this frenzy and also what's going on, we have terrorism in our country. You have this photograph that captures a moment of stillness. And I like it because it takes away from all that frenzy in terms of in the end, 9/11 was about death. Unfortunately, it was about terrorism, but it's really ultimately about death and people innocently dying and people being caught in such a situation where falling off of a building is better than staying and burning alive in a building. That's in some ways also why this photograph is powerful because it's God, that's better than dying in the building. It's falling off the building. Like what a it really captures the moment and how, I don't want to say crazy it was, but how incredible it was in terms of the human condition and experience. So I think it's a very moving image. And I will just go a little over on the wars on terror we have, especially the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. So, as you all know, we have the war in Afghanistan, and this happens immediately after 9/11. It happens actually less than a month after 9/11. The US invades Afghanistan because we believe, and this is true actually, that the Taliban harbored Al Qaeda, that they were helping Al Qaeda to operate in Afghanistan. And I will say, Al Qaeda is not just in Afghanistan, it's in Saudi Arabia, it's in Pakistan, but we target Afghanistan. This is also a little bit controversial because 19 of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, but we didn't invade Saudi Arabia. And to be quite frank, we didn't really go after Saudi Arabia. We didn't, punish them, so to speak. We didn't put sanctions on them because Saudi Arabia is an ally for the US. Saudi Arabia produces a massive amount of oil that we were still reliant on at that time. So we didn't want to upset our Saudi Arabian friends, so to speak, our allies. So that's one of the reasons why we chose Afghanistan. And as you all know, with Afghanistan and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, it's not a good decision in the sense that, like, Afghanistan seems to be the country that no Western nation or European nation or American nation can win over, so to speak. Anyway, so we invade Afghanistan. We call it Operation Enduring Freedom. Again, it's not a war, it's an operation, a military operation. We begin with airstrikes, but later we do put boots on the ground. And it's not just American boots or American troops. It's also, British troops, it's Canadian troops, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, even, there's a coalition, an international coalition that, tried to attack and get rid of Al Qaeda and the Taliban even. And in the beginning, I would say we were successful in the sense that we were able to take control of Afghanistan for the most part. We had substantial gains in terms of taking control of its government, but also its cities and its urban areas. But with Afghanistan, it's really difficult for us to maintain this control. And it's even more difficult for us to figure out how are we going to exit out of Afghanistan. Okay, we invaded the country. Well, what are we going to do? Just leave it and leave it, in shambles, leave it with no clear governing power? Like, you can't do that because now you've created a void. And we do this later in Iraq, unfortunately. You've created a void. So who's going to take that void? We don't want the Taliban to take it or another terrorist group or Al Qaeda. So we have to make sure we maintain control to make sure that the right people take control of Afghanistan. And this is difficult too because Afghanistan doesn't have a lot of experienced leaders, particularly experienced leaders who are pro-American. It's not just that we want experienced leaders. We want leaders that are going to, work with us, the US. So we're in a pickle, so to speak. We're in this really difficult this employment place with Afghanistan. Because the way this and what's also difficult about Afghanistan, as you all know, I'm sure from the Soviet war, is that they have the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were forces that originally were fighting. Actually, this is going back in history, but the Mujahideen are groups of, Afghan leaders. They're kind of like informal groups, guerrilla groups, so to speak. And they're very good. I would say they're just very effective fighters, in part because they know the area of Afghanistan so well, in part because they feel morally and religiously not superior, but in the sense that they have a moral and religious reason for fighting the US that's maybe stronger than the reason why the US is fighting them. They have nothing to lose, so to speak. The Mujahideen has nothing to lose. What's also difficult about the Mujahideen is they are fighting with weapons that the US actually gave to them about 20 years prior when the US gave weapons and technology to the Mujahideen when they were fighting against the Soviets in the Afghan Soviet War. So this is just like the Persian Gulf War with Saddam Hussein in the 90s. We're fighting the group of people that we gave weapons to before. It's just like history comes full circle again. Yes, it's frustrating as someone who looks back on this. Like, we're fighting the people we helped in the beginning. Just makes you roll your eyes. You get frustrated. And they're good, unfortunately. Like, they're really effective warriors and soldiers. They know their mountains and their rural areas well, which is very difficult to fight in. They can hide in the mountains. They can hide in the caves. You have also the barrier of the mountain, which can withstand at times rockets and bombs. So it's difficult. And it's one of the reasons why the war in Afghanistan lasts for such a long time. It is our longest war. It technically ends in December of 2014, but we still have troops on the ground. We do. Because, we don't have a lot of faith that Afghanistan has a viable security force or government force to take control and to maintain control so that other international terrorist groups don't take over it. So there's, like I said, there's no easy exit strategy, and it's a little bit of the same in Iraq too. In 2003, we later invade Iraq, in part because we claim that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and that they might be harboring terrorist groups too. This later honestly proved to be false, which is why I have to roll my eyes a little bit. Like, how could we invade a country under false, facts? What happened with our intelligence? Why was our intelligence wrong? Our intelligence is supposed to be the best, But I don't know. I don't know everything about the Iraq war because, some things are still classified. Same with the war in Afghanistan. We, as a public in America, don't know everything because some things are still classified. But the war in Iraq, it was similar to Afghanistan in that it wasn't a war. It was an operation. We called it Operation Iraqi Freedom. And like Afghanistan, it was U.S. along with foreign nations that invaded Iraq. It was a coalition of forces. And like Afghanistan, we were able to take control of the country fairly quickly. We were able to oust Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party. But like Afghanistan, it's like, okay, we got rid of these people. Who's going to take over? There's no one really that we can think of. And that's a big problem. In Afghanistan, there's a power void. And in Iraq, there's a power void. And again, our exit strategy, what is it? How are we going to peacefully leave Iraq and Afghanistan or ensure that it's in better hands than it was before we invaded, so to speak? So that was difficult. And, even though we have the victory of capturing Osama bin Laden, which we did in May 2011, and Saddam Hussein in 2003, actually December 2003, these wars, they've certainly made us think in terms of American history and as Americans, what should the U.S. responsibility be in engaging in a war? How much intervention should there be by the U.S.? It's kind of like the Vietnam War. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq has really made us reconsider what is the military's role for the U.S. and what is U.S. foreign policy even to these countries. How do we engage in these countries? How do we make the world a better place, but also maintain security and protect ourselves and other nations? It's just, I think it's opened up more questions than it has given us answers, these wars on terror. And it's something I think today we still think about. And it's difficult for us to think about because these have been very difficult wars. Again, war is not pretty. A lot of soldiers died, American soldiers, coalition soldiers, Iraqi soldiers who are fighting on behalf of the U.S. died, and even Afghan soldiers died. So a lot of innocent lives have died. And so you have to wonder, was it all worth it? And I think no one will disagree that, especially with Afghanistan, that we needed to at least destabilize the Taliban, make sure Al Qaeda doesn't get stronger. But in terms of like, what is our purpose there after we get rid of these forces? We don't know. You know, should we just have left? I don't know. Are we responsible for what happens after a nation when we invade? So anyway, and this is a picture of George Bush I have here. He proclaimed on May 1st, 2003, that mission was accomplished in Iraq in terms of its combat operations. It was a very famous speech. Some people thought it was premature, like you're claiming victory when there's really not clear victory yet. But it was a very, very famous speech, and it was a very famous image too, with mission accomplished in the background. And this was also a famous image. This was a picture of Obama and his administration, his key staff members. Here's Joe Biden, actually, and Hillary Clinton. They were witnessing, I don't know exactly if they were looking at a video or something, but it was during the capture and the killing of Osama bin Laden. Very famous image. It turns out he was hiding in Pakistan. So, before I move on to Obama, I will mention also about the Orange Revolution. You all know about the Orange Revolution, but I'll be honest, a lot of Americans probably don't. I had to learn myself about it. But it was a very controversial election between Yanukovych and Yushchenko. Later on, Yushchenko suffered poisoning, and I think I got that wrong, guys. Oh, never mind. Sorry. No, it was correct. Okay. I have to keep my names straight. Yushchenko and Yanukovych. Yanukovych is declared the winner, but everybody is like, no, this was fraud. And they protest. This is part of the Orange Revolution. It was Yushchenko's color. And during this tumultuous time, I would say, during this election period, you do have pro-Russian Ukrainians and even some Russians who claim that these protests are orchestrated by the West and financed with American money. I don't know where they got that information. I have not found any viable sources that says that's true. It's fake news. But I will say, with regard to the US and the Orange Revolution, the George Bush did support Ukraine in terms of its movement towards pro-European, pro-Western alliances and reformation. So we supported Ukraine, and we certainly supported, after Yushchenko's declaration of winning, we supported Yushchenko. And here is a picture of Bush and Yushchenko shaking hands. So we did support them, but like, like with Kerry and even today, unfortunately, our support has been a lot of lip service, I would say, especially under George Bush. George Bush, he did support Ukraine, but he wasn't very outspoken about it, in part because he didn't want to upset Russia. Because during this time period with the war on terror, Russia is seen as an ally. It's seen as a friend in fighting this war on terror. So we didn't want to upset Russia for that reason. And we didn't want to upset them for like what we always seem to have a reason for. We didn't want to upset Russia because of a nuclear war, or a world war, basically. We did, after Yushchenko was declared the winner, we do start to send support, not financial aid, but international aid to Ukraine to support processes and reforms for pro-Western, so to speak, reforms. So this is kind of the beginning, I would say. I mean, I'm sure we've sent international aid to Ukraine in the 90s, but this is when I would say we really start to get the ball rolling. And it really, really increases after the Revolution of Dignity. But this is maybe the little beginnings of it. But again, this is unfortunate. I find this frustrating as an American. We're always just saying we support Ukraine, and yeah, we give money, but I'm like, Russia's still committing its acts. So is this really effective? Like, I don't know. What more can we do? And that's a big question that I still think about today. What should the U.S. do, with regards to Ukraine, in terms of like, how can we be a good ally? should we continue to send foreign aid to Ukraine? Should we continue to send military aid? Maybe not. Maybe some of you say, we actually don't want the US to help. But maybe some of you say, no, we want more US support and help. Or maybe you say, if you're going to help us, send troops. Or maybe some of you don't want troops in in Ukraine, because it might just make things messier. I don't know, but it's a big issue, I think, in our foreign policy. Like, what do we do for countries that are being attacked, but we fear destabilizing the world order, so to speak, especially in fighting Russia. So anyway, and during Bush's presidency, I do have to mention this is also the start and the rupture of the Russian-Georgian war. And I say Georgia not on America's mind because there's a famous song by Ray Charles, Georgia on My Mind. Unfortunately, the Russian invasion of Georgia was not really on many Americans' minds. Part of this is because it's during the Summer Olympics. And actually, that's why I remember the invasion. Because literally, as soon as the Olympics are happening, Russia invaded Georgia. And I was thinking, man, what a great time to do it. When all the world is distracted and watching the Olympics, you're going to have this military conflict. So I thought that was actually very primal timing for Russia to escalate this conflict with Georgia. And like I said, too, it happens during the Bush administration. So he kind of gives the same response as he did with the Orange Revolution. We do try to pressure Russia to do a ceasefire, not only pressure Russia, but Georgia. We send our diplomats from the US, as well as the EU also has diplomats. We send them to Georgia to broker a ceasefire. We even send Condoleezza Rice to France and to Georgia. So we're trying to work internationally and diplomatically with other nations to try to pressure Russia and also Georgia to stop the fighting. I don't know if that's effective, so to speak. I mean, yes, there is a ceasefire, but later on, of course, it's not really, it has no substance because Russia later recognizes South Ossetia and Abkhazia's independence. And even though the rest of the world doesn't really recognize it, it's kind of like how Russia does it with Crimea. They claim that it's independent, and then they take ownership of it, basically. So that's why I say the ceasefire, even though it's accomplished, it doesn't really have any teeth to it. Now, when Russia does declare South Ossetia's and Abkhazia's independence, President Bush did state that he said, kind of like what we always say, we condemn these actions. He said the United States condemns the decision by the Russian president to recognize as independent states the Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The territorial integrity and borders of Georgia must be respected just as those of Russia or any other country. So, we say all the right things, but I think, for our words to have oomph in them and to have real strength in them, we have to back it with some sort of action. Now, what that action should be, I don't know. Russia is pretty immune, it seems, at the moment to our sanctions. I mean, I know they're hurting because of our sanctions, but it only seems to embolden President Putin and some Russians, in terms of their fight against America and European forces at times, and Ukraine as well. So anyway, I want to focus, or I wanted to at least focus on Georgia because it's really a precursor to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this is kind of like Russia's first big step into like really clawing its teeth, or no, not clawing its teeth, showing its claws and attacking. Before we kind of see Russia as like, they might be our ally, they might not be, we don't really know much about this Putin guy. I mean, we know some things. He worked for the KGB, but maybe he could be our friend, or he could be, at least we can work with him. Here, we're starting to get into, Putin and the Russian government really, flexing its muscles, so to speak. Um, and another consequence of Georgia, especially why it's so important to Ukraine, as you all know, is that this is really, it shows to Putin and to Russia in general that, if Putin, commits these acts, the international community is not really going to respond. The international community doesn't have the true willpower to test and counter Russia's aggression. I mean, maybe it will. Like, I could be a total pessimist, or the glass is half empty, and maybe something good will happen with the international community and really setting Russia in its place and saying, "You can't do this. Stop it." But at the moment, I don't see that happening, unfortunately. I want it to happen, of course, but I don't see it happening. So, I know, guys, it's, thank you for being patient. I know I'm kind of going a little over time, but there's a lot to say, actually, in these past 30 years, too. Here we have Obama now. Obama is very famous even today. He's been kind of quiet, though, recently. He hasn't really spoken out against Trump, so to speak. He has, though, spoken out against, the racial injustices and the police brutality that we're witnessing now. But he's kind of kept a low-key profile. But to tell you a little bit more about Barack Obama, so his full name is Barack Hussein Obama Jr. He's a junior. His father also had the same name. He was born in 1961 in Hawaii, which is kind of cool. He was born to an American woman, an American mother, and a Kenyan father. I don't know why I put American woman and Kenyan father. It should be an American mother and a Kenyan father. Excuse me. So he had a really interesting background. He did. And he actually grew up later in a little bit in Indonesia because his mother was studying anthropology. He then went, I think, back to Hawaii. He lived with his grandparents for a bit, who lived in Hawaii. And then later on, he went to University at Occidental College, which is a small college in California. And then later he transferred to Columbia. And then he went to Harvard Law School. And he moved to Chicago. But during, his young upbringing, he was able to meet his father. I read he was able to meet his Kenyan brothers and sisters and his relatives. So he really is truly African American, but he identifies as Black American. But anyway, so he's a really interesting background. I think he grew up in a very international, multiracial upbringing, which I think has an effect on him. And I think he very much believes in compromise and getting together to speak out our differences and problems, so to speak. But growing up, or not growing up, but after college, when he's young, he has several different jobs. He mainly does community organizing, and he moves to Chicago. After law school, he moves to Chicago and he works at a law firm. Or he doesn't move to Chicago, he moved back to Chicago, excuse me. He went to Harvard Law School, but that was just a brief moment in his young adult life while he was living in Chicago. So he moves back to Chicago and he works at a law firm. He meets his wife, Michelle, who is also famous in her own way, just like Hillary Clinton, like everybody knows Barack Obama and everybody knows Michelle Obama too. They have two daughters, Sasha and Malia. And after he works at his law firm, he teaches at the University of Chicago Law School for 12 years. And then starting in the 90s, he works his way into government. He's first an Illinois state senator for about 7 years. And then for 3 years, which is not a long time, he's a senator for Illinois in Congress. So it's not to say he's inexperienced, but he is considered to be a young politician, not only because of his age, but because of how many years he's in politics. It's not a lot. There are other politicians, especially his opponent during 2008 presidential election, John McCain, who has decades of experience. But he is able to win in 2008 for presidency. This is actually one of his posters from his presidential campaign. I don't believe it's an official poster. I don't know if he endorsed this, but it was a very famous one that many people used to show their support for Obama, but also, you know, it's a famous poster because it's a different kind of graphic and image. It's kind of modern, it's new. It was very different from John McCain's presidential posters and signage. And that's kind of Obama in the sense that, like, when he was running against John McCain, who was much older than him, and John McCain is an older white man, Obama really represented like the young new America, so to speak, the a young America that kind of grew up and developed after the fall of the Cold War, and kind of had newer ideas maybe, or a more optimistic tone in their beliefs and in their policies too. And I think it's one of the reasons why he was able to win the election. Also, because people did want to see change, and part of that change was having the first African American president. He's our first, and he's our only right now. But when he became president, he did inherit, remember, a deep economic recession. He came president in January, I should really say January 2009, excuse me. Anyway, I got the dates wrong, guys. I'm sorry. So George W. Bush ends his presidency actually in 2009. Excuse me, the date is wrong. So Obama he's president from 2009 officially to 2017 officially. Anyway, I'm sorry, I got kind of the dates wrong here, guys. It's confusing because you're elected president the year before, but you don't officially start presidency till January, I think 21st in America. Anyway, but he does inherit a deep economic recession. He actually bails out some of the major companies like GMC, which really upsets some Americans. It's like, you're bailing out these companies, they should collapse. It's their fault they got into this mess. But I think Obama's viewpoint was, well, they hold so much weight. They have such a sizable influence as well as jobs. There's a lot of people they employ that they shouldn't collapse. GMC is our automobile. It's an American automobile company, and they're pretty large. And so he bailed them out. And the common expression during this time period is they're too big to fail. Some companies are so powerful and so big that if they fail, it would have major economic consequences. And GMC was thought to be one of those. I think another one today would be like Amazon. If Amazon collapsed, it would have huge economic repercussions, I think, in America. He was against the war in Iraq when he was a senator. And even when he was president, he promised to, withdraw troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. But I will say he did increase the use of drones in warfare during his time period. And that's controversial. Some people don't like drones. They say it's not fair, it's immoral to use drones, while others say it's better than using troops. It's just a controversial topic in America, and he used them. And some people don't like him for that, because typically Democrats, or at least at the time, Democrats weren't seen to be like pro-war, or that they weren't going to continue the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. He was pro-immigration reform, and he supported the Dreamers. And Dreamers are children who come to America illegally when they're very young. Their parents bring them over the border, or they bring them, they extend their visa, whatever. And they're very young though, but they come to America illegally. And it's just, I don't know how sizable the group is. It's maybe a couple million, but it's kind of a controversial topic because, generally speaking, Republicans and conservatives, they don't like supporting any form of illegal immigration, even if it's children. So they don't really like the DREAM Act or the Dreamers. Whereas Democrats say, well, they were children. They didn't know any better. They didn't purposely come to this country illegally. They were brought by their parents. So Obama generally supported these Dreamers. But I will say, even though he was for pro-immigration reform, he actually had the largest number of arrests of illegal and legal immigrants for crimes committed by them. So this is what's weird about Obama. There are moments when you're like, oh, you're doing something that we Democrats like. but then he'll do something that it's like, oh, that's something we Democrats don't like. So he's generally, I would say, respected and admired, especially among Democrats. But there are definitely those Democrats, people, and as well as conservatives and Republicans who are like, you did things that weren't very democratic or that were hypocritical, maybe. So he's a little bit of a controversy, I would say. Um, he did end the don't ask, don't tell policy in America, which was very controversial. It started to become controversial in the early 2000s because, I would say in the past 20 years, America has largely, moved from kind of a homophobic country to a very pro LGBTQ country. That's not to say everybody in this country is pro LGBTQ or, they're not necessarily homophobic, but they just don't believe that gay marriage should be legal or that even homosexuality is morally right, so to speak. But generally speaking, in our society, in terms of gay rights, there's been great improvements, I would say. Speaking as I did about yesterday with the federal laws to protect gay employees for being fired. But the don't ask, don't tell policy was a policy actually kind of initiated by Clinton, which was the idea that you don't ask someone if they're gay in the military, and if you don't ask, you don't tell. That was the whole idea. Like, don't ask someone if they're gay in the military, and if you find out or if you yourself are gay, don't tell. And there was this belief, even to today, I would say in the U.S. military, that if you start to bring up these issues that might be controversial, like being gay, or bring issues such as up like gay marriage or sexual assault in the military, even though they're important issues, you might stir some bad feelings among your comrades in the military, and you might end up creating divisions when you didn't need to have divisions. So Clinton supported this policy, not because I would say he's homophobic. He wasn't. It's just there's kind of this belief that, like, all these personal differences that you might have about you, we don't really want to bring them out in the military because you might cause division or it might bring division or bad relations among your units. And the whole point of the military is that you're one group, you're one unit, you act in unison. So you don't want to create divisions. I will say something big that happened during Obama's presidency too was gay marriage became legal in America in 2015. That was a very big moment during his presidency. Even though he didn't have anything to do with it because it's the Supreme Court, it was just more of like the celebration that happened during his time period, He did pass the Affordable Care Act, which was very controversial, still is today to an extent. It's called Obamacare now, but it's technically called the Affordable Care Act. And it didn't give health care to all Americans, but it certainly increased health insurance and health coverage to many Americans. Not all, but to many. And when it comes to his foreign policy, Obama walked a fine line, a kind of the middle, when it came to conflicts such as the Syrian civil war. Again, we didn't invade Syria. We didn't put in like 500,000 troops, but we did send troops to try to fight against ISIS that was in Syria. We also sent military aid and support to Syrian rebels who were fighting against the Assad regime. So, and that's kind of been our foreign policy since then. We won't send in our troops necessarily, or at least a sizable amount, but we'll give military aid in other ways. With Iran, Obama was able to make a treaty with Iran where, they would decrease the number of sanctions on Iran and give Iran a chance to prove to itself that it's not making nuclear weapons. So that was kind of seen as a big step. He also kind of opened the relationships and the border between America and Cuba, so Americans could visit Cuba, and I believe vice versa. But it was basically an opening up relations because America and Cuba, ever since the Cold War, we've kind of been closed off to each other. And of course, he walked a fine line with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With the Revolution of Dignity, and again, this is kind of like Bush, actually. He continued Bush's kind of policy. Um, Obama refrained from taking direct action to help Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, I mean, we certainly condemned the invasion. We condemned Russia's invasion of Crimea. We condemned their invasion of eastern Ukraine, and we continue to condemn it. But we take a more diplomatic approach, even under Trump now. And by diplomacy, what I mean by that mostly is that we'll speak out against Russia's action. We'll maybe push more sanctions on Russia, but we won't send troops on the ground. We'll continue to support to give military and security aid to Ukraine. And right now, at least between 2014 and 2016, we sent about $600 million worth of military and security aid. But something to note with Obama, he would not send lethal weapons like the Javelin missiles, those missiles, I think they're called the Javelin missiles. This is the one that Trump later sent to Zelensky, but he wouldn't do it. And he didn't want to send the lethal weapons because he feared that it would just escalate the conflict. And it would really, I don't know, maybe it would put America more into the conflict, and Russia might find it even more threatening, so to speak. And like I said, when Russia invaded Crimea, and as it continued to invade eastern Ukraine, we did pass sanctions against Russian individuals, and we did state that the Crimean referendum would never be recognized by the US. And to this day, we don't recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Crimea is Ukraine. In fact, I think Pompeo said that a couple of days ago or yesterday. Crimea is Ukraine. But again, it's lip service, and I don't know what's better, I don't know what we should do. This is the big dilemma now with US-Ukrainian relations in some ways. Like how should the US support Ukraine? But let me continue with Obama. I will say one of the reasons why I think that Obama didn't want to intervene in Ukraine when Russia invaded, there's three primary reasons. And I think these reasons also continue to influence Trump administration's support or their relationship with Ukraine, so to speak. So the US was fatigued. We were very tired by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We spent over $6 trillion fighting the wars. So we're really tired of wars. And I think that's a big reason why we didn't want to send troops on the ground. And also Obama promised during his presidency, he would withdraw troops from those countries, that we would not be sending more troops into other countries or, putting more troops on the ground. So this would be kind of going against his promise. And a lot of Americans also didn't want to send more troops on the ground, kind of take a break and really think about what our foreign policy is, so to speak. Another major reason why I think that Obama didn't intervene in Ukraine, especially with the Revolution of Dignity, is that, Ukraine, unfortunately, is a core interest for Moscow, but not really for Washington. I would say in our minds, at least in our foreign policy, our biggest worries or concern tend to be Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and any sort of international terrorist group. That's who we tend to focus on. Other countries, be it Georgia or Ukraine, it's not really at our forefront. It's not our focus. They're kind of in the periphery, in the background. So, and, Russia, I would say, cares more about Ukraine and its future than we do, so to speak, in terms of Russia really is concerned, will Ukraine get stronger? How can we take over it or something? How can we influence it? Whereas the US, we're just like, oh gosh, we'll see what happens a little bit. I mean, we'll support Ukraine and we'll support its movement towards democracy, but we have other things to worry about. And that's just I think part of the mentality, to be honest. And another thing, of course, as I always said, we always have this fear, at least among US presidents, that if we, escalate things, might we end up with a war with Russia? And do we really want a war with Russia right now? Because it might be deadly, very deadly. It might turn into a world war. And more importantly, will they use nuclear weapons? We don't know. We don't know what each side is capable of, what's the brinkmanship, so to speak. Uh, but like I said, we do support Ukraine, and we certainly support Ukraine's reforms. I know some people, the reforms have been controversial. They might be good, they might be bad. I know Ukraine is right now reforming its healthcare system based on, I believe, EU standards. So, it's just something to think about for Ukrainians, of course, for you all, as well as Americans. Like, what should Ukraine's future be? What might it look like? Um, and here's just a picture of President Obama and Poroshenko when he was elected at the time in June 2014. It's just kind of the typical image, like, a Bush and Yushchenko. We shake hands. We don't want Ukraine to think we don't support it. Like I said, sending troops on the ground, I don't know. And again, also, I don't know if that's what you all want too. Um, anyway. So this is the last president, the current president, Trump. So you see, yeah, I got the dates wrong with Obama. It should be 2009 to 2017, guys. I want to mention that. I got it wrong. It's confusing because, like I said, the president is elected in November of the previous year, but he starts his presidency 2 months after in the next year. But anyway, about Donald Trump, our current president of the United States. And we don't know if he's going to be president in the next 4 years. He may or he may not be. It's going to have to be, it's going to come down to a showdown in November. I cannot tell you who's going to win in November. Some people say, oh, yeah, definitely Joe Biden, because Trump has done a horrible job with the coronavirus and the police brutality. But you know what? People underestimated Trump in 2016 in the election, so I'm not going to underestimate him again. He could win. He could. But regardless, he's the president right now. So Donald J. Trump, or John Trump, that's his middle name, John. He was born in New York in 1946. He's actually the oldest president to be elected. I believe that when he became president, he was, oh my gosh, 71. I think Reagan was 69. And I think it was actually Trump's birthday 2 days ago or something, and he's 75. I can't remember the specifics, but anyway, or he's 74, excuse me. He was born in 46. So he was 70, I think, when he was elected. So anyway, he is so far the oldest president elected. He was born in Queens to wealthy real estate developers. Both his mother and his father had a really good real estate business named, I think, Elizabeth and Sons. And later, Fred Trump had his own company, I believe, as well. So his parents were well off. They were also in real estate. Trump attended a military academy, I believe, in high school. It was a military preparatory academy. He never served in the military, though. Even though he went to a military academy, he never served in the military. In fact, he was able to get a draft. He was able to dodge the Vietnam draft. He was able to get a medical excuse for not serving in the Vietnam War draft. And some people don't like that. He went to Fordham University, which is in New York. And then later he transferred to the Wharton School of Business, which is at the University of Pennsylvania. He worked for his family business for a while, but then he later started his own real estate developments. Really beginning in the 1980s is when he starts to rise up. And I will just say this, I have to mention it. He claims that he got a small loan from his father to start his own business. It was more like a $60 million loan / inheritance gift. So, it's weird. At times, I think Trump likes to pose himself as like an ordinary man, but in other ways, he's not. He grew up from a really wealthy family, and then he got a lot of money to start his own business. So he's always been well off. It's just a fact. He's been well off. He's of the upper class in America. And some people like that, and some people see it as a sign of his success and his family's success. And they like that. And they believe that his success in real estate and in even movie, TV deals make him a successful president, But anyway, he has a history, I will say, of shady business deals. I mean shady in the sense that, like, the money he got was from bank loans, and some of it was even from, I believe, bonds. And this is the thing, what's hard about Trump, or what I have to mention about him. Most of the time, what he does, I would say, is probably not illegal. It's just not morally right. Like, it's not the normal, or usually the socially acceptable ways to do things. Um, but it's not illegal necessarily either, you know. Yeah. A good example is during the presidential election in 2016, there was a video clip that showed him saying something very derogatory about women. You can grab them by the you know what. And it's like, that's a really disgusting statement. Uh, and it's morally wrong, socially wrong, but it's not illegal. What he said was not illegal. It was just his expression. But it's an example of how, like, he says things and often does things that aren't necessarily maybe illegal, but they're morally wrong. They're inappropriate at times. So he has that with his business too. He had the Taj Mahal casino. He had his own airlines. Um, and then later on, he actually became very famous because of his show, The Apprentice. It was a reality TV show, and it starred him and his family. And it went on for about 11 years. And this is actually a picture of him with his logo, Trump's image. And I show this because it's a great example of how, like, more than anything, what Trump is brilliant at is publicizing himself, being a media figure. He may not be brilliant in politics, he might not be brilliant in business, but he's brilliant in media and public relations. Let's put it that way. He's a brilliant media relations person. He knows how to sell things. He's a salesman, in my opinion. More than a real estate agent or a real estate developer or even a president, he's most famously, to me, in my opinion, a very famous and a really good salesman. He knows how to sell things, even if the product itself is not good, or it's wrong, or it's immoral. He knows how to sell it. And that's kind of how he ran for president. He sold his idea and himself, and his logo, or his caption, was "Make America Great Again," which again is not his originally. But so it's kind of like a little immoral in the sense that, like, he's taking Reagan's expression, not his own, and he's claiming it as his. And later, he actually copyrights it. But it's an example of how, like, he's a great salesman, or great as in not moral necessarily, but he's great in that he's effective and successful in that regard. He can convince people to buy his goods or buy his ideas. And one of them is "Make America Great." And when he was running for that platform, what his idea of making America great again, part of it was, to stop illegal immigration, build the wall, and make Mexico pay for it. I don't know how you do that, but that was one of his promises. Another one was ending unfair trade deals with China. We've been cheated and scammed by China, and we're continuing to be so with this coronavirus. He also promised to abolish Obamacare, and he was very friendly to law enforcement, in part because a lot of law enforcement were his voters, like, they're his base. He was also very friendly to oil and gas companies. He promised to roll back a lot of regulations, environmental regulations. But I will say, even though Trump is a Republican, he's not a traditionally conservative, or he's not like a traditional Republican or even a conservative. There are things that he believes in or that he has done that is not really what Republicans would want. One of the big things is, ending kind of globalization and taking America out of NAFTA and even NATO. And I will say personally, like, I think Trump is trying to make America go back to a little bit of isolationism, which I don't personally like. This was our isolationist period was, before World War II, under Wilson, even Harding. There's this period where America kind of just thought, well, we'll do our thing and everybody else can do their thing. Trump is kind of going back to that era a little bit, in part because he feels that America has been wronged and cheated because of globalization, and that people haven't, especially nations, haven't uh, fulfilled their end of the bargain. So, anyway, during his presidency, he has done a few, memorable things, remarkable things. He did select two conservative Supreme Court justices, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, which was a big deal. That's one of the big reasons why people voted for him. There are a lot of Republicans, even if they didn't like Trump personality or, him personally, they liked that he was a Republican and that he was going to be pro-life and that he was going to appoint Supreme Court justices, conservative ones. He did try to enact a travel ban from predominantly Muslim countries. That has since been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It's also seen as, again, this is almost like another example where maybe not necessarily illegal, because normally the president and the executive power can make immigration decisions, but it's just not morally right. Like, you're targeting a group of people based on their religion, generally, these countries. He also passed a tax cut that primarily helped corporations and wealthy Americans. It did. It did provide benefits to everyday Americans, but those benefits, I found out, run out in 2025. 2025, gosh, weird to say. And then he also decreased the corporate tax rate to 21%. So a lot of people have seen this tax cut as primarily helping corporations and wealthy Americans, not everyday Americans. But some Republicans would say, well, if you give corporations a tax break, then they'll give their workers and everybody else a tax break, the whole trickle down economics. But I personally don't believe in trickle down economics. It usually doesn't work. When you give people a tax break, they're not going to share that money. They usually keep it for themselves or their family. It's just human nature, unfortunately. And lastly, as I said, he's known for his very controversial remarks, like grab them by the you-know-what. But a lot of people don't mind that, especially his supporters who are diehard believers. They don't mind that. And even some moderate center Republicans don't mind that, because for them, the ends justify the means. Even though Trump does things in a way that's not traditional, in a way that might be socially bad or what you might find immoral, because he still delivers on an action, it's okay the way he does it. Even though he does it the weird way or the wrong way, he still gets it done, and that's okay. And that's what I think, why so many people can, or at least a lot of Republicans, support him. They might not like him as a person, but it's okay because he does laws, he passes laws that they like. And this is a picture I have to show you of Trump at a rally in Orlando. This was in June of 2019. I just show this picture because this is where Trump is in his element. He gets to speak without a speech, he gets to be surrounded by his supporters. He loves it. He absolutely loves it. And he's actually going to have a big rally June 20th in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But I don't know how that's going to go because we still have COVID. But anyway. All right, guys, we're almost done. Thank you for being patient. This is, I think, one of my last slides. So I do have to mention about Trump and the quid pro quo that happened with President Zelensky and him. As you all know, there was a big scandal involving Trump and Zelensky. It's not really Zelensky's fault at all, actually. It's Trump, really. In 2018, Congress continued to provide assistance to Ukraine, and they approved actually another $250 million to Ukraine. But it turns out later that Trump froze the aid that was approved by Congress. And in July 25th, 2019, he had a phone call with Zelensky. And it turns out that Trump was kind of basically wanting to do a quid pro quo with Zelensky. We'll give you this aid if you do this for us. And it turns out what he wanted Zelensky to do was, Again, is it illegal? I don't know, but it's certainly immoral. It's not socially acceptable or even internationally acceptable. But this phone call that he had with Zelensky was later uncovered and found by a whistleblower, or a whistleblower drew attention to it sometime in September, I believe. And that's when the aid actually froze in Ukraine. Or when the freeze on the aid to Ukraine it ended. But the whistleblower drew attention to it in September. Said, "Hey, there was this phone call between President Zelensky and Trump. Congress, you should be aware of it because something immoral might have happened." And basically, Trump pressure Ukraine to investigate his political rival Joe Biden's son Hunter, who was on a board, who was a board member on a Ukrainian company in the past. So Democrats think that Trump withheld this aid so that Zelensky could investigate Hunter Biden and maybe his past actions in Ukraine. Now, the Republicans and Trump say, no, I only withheld this Ukraine because I wanted to put pressure. Trump claims he wanted to put pressure on European allies and other countries to contribute more money to Ukraine. And Trump has the belief that Ukraine's government was corrupt, and he didn't trust Ukraine's government, and he didn't trust Ukraine to use the money well, I guess, from America. But anyway, it turns out to a big scandal starting in late September, and eventually the Democrats in the House of Representatives begin an impeachment inquiry in October. And they claim that Trump's quid pro quo was illegal and an abuse of power. Trump claims that it wasn't an abuse of power. It might have not been what you think is morally right or what is acceptable, but it wasn't illegal, But anyway, the House, which was controlled by Democrats, impeached Trump. So he's the third president to ever be impeached. But the Senate, like with Clinton, actually acquitted him. They said, no, he's not guilty. And I will just say this. In general, what I find with Trump is that he's skeptical, I would say, about Ukraine's capability to be a good ally. A good ally in the sense that he thinks that there's too much corruption in Ukraine. He's worried about that. There were also some of his supporters, like Rudy Giuliani, who claimed, without evidence, that Ukraine hacked into the US election systems in 2016. And that's another reason why you can't trust Ukraine. And I think that Rudy Giuliani and some of his supporters were voicing this claim because they wanted to divert attention from Russia. It's well known and well documented by intelligence leaders that Russia hacked into US election systems. And they also did a large social media campaign to influence US voters to vote against Hillary or to vote for Trump or to sow even more divisions. And this looks bad on Trump. Trump doesn't like this because it makes it seem like he won unfairly. So he doesn't like that. And I think it's one of the reasons maybe why Trump is friendly to Russia. Because if he treats Russia as an adversary, then it's almost like for him admitting that Russia did commit nefarious acts during the election and that maybe his election as president wasn't credible. It doesn't have credit because it was really manipulated by Russia in part. So that might be another reason why Trump is friendly to Vladimir Putin, at least. I don't understand fully why Trump, unlike Congress and unlike most Americans, Trump is just, for some reason, unusually friendly to Vladimir Putin. He's also friendly to Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea. So it's just weird to me and to a lot of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, why he's friendly. Because for us, Putin is generally an adversary. I think part of the reason why Trump is friendly to Putin personally is that I think Trump admires Putin. I think he admires him in the sense that Putin has kind of full control of his country. Putin is able to stifle and to quiet criticism uh, in ways that are wrong. He sometimes kills his critics. But I think Trump admires that. Like, he admires the strong man. And Putin, in his mind, is a strong man. And I think Trump wishes he was like that at times. Again, I don't really know why. Maybe Putin has, a secret about Trump or his companies that we don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. It's a mystery. Um, but that is where we leave kind of with Ukrainian US relations and the US today. But I did want to share with you, again, I know it's been over time, but I do want to share with you a few of my thoughts. My thoughts, these are my personal thoughts. These are not Fulbright's thoughts. These are not all Americans' thoughts or even US foreign policy thoughts. These are just my personal thoughts on US Ukrainian relations and kind of like my questions going forward. And I just wanted to leave them with you all. Um, I would say, what seems to dictate in the past and even today with US Ukrainian relations is that there's this motto we have in America, and it might be around the world too: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I would say this is the motto that seems to dictate US relationship with all post Soviet countries, not just Ukraine, but will generally relate to and support a country in terms of, the fact that it's probably an enemy of Russia, so it's my friend. Now, I can't say that completely because Belarus, I know, has a leader who maybe, quote unquote, is friendly with Russia. So it's not with, I shouldn't even say it's with all post Soviet countries, but most post Soviet countries, have an interesting relationship with Russia. And typically I don't think it's always a good one. It might be adversarial. It certainly is with Ukraine and Georgia. But I would say this is what dictates at least US Ukrainian relations right now from the US perspective. I don't like it. I don't like that we only seem to care about Ukraine because Ukraine is the enemy of Russia, or we only seem to think about Ukraine in terms of what is Russia doing to it, and how is Ukraine responding. And I don't really like that because we're not really learning about Ukraine in another facet. We're only seeing it in this very limited scope of what is Ukraine in relation to Russia? How is it responding? What is it doing? And yes, we care about Ukraine developing, or so to speak, changing its policies and making reforms. But again, that's also in the sense that, they're becoming more Western and they're becoming less, so to speak, Russian or less Soviet, so to speak. And again, I don't like that because I think that's kind of one dimensional. And that's not fair for any country. It's not fair for Ukraine, for US to look at it that way. It's not fair for any country, whether it's Kenya or Greenland or Venezuela. We should never look at a country in a one dimensional way. And yet, I find personally we tend to do that, at least with Ukraine. Hopefully, and I think it is changing. Um, you know, and another thought I have personally is, as I said before, that the Cold War never really ended. We still have the trace of like the Cold War mentality, and that's not good because we're not in the Cold War. This is a new era, and we need to look at countries in our policy and revisit them, relook at them, and see how can we move forward. And like I said, Ukraine has a tendency to be written about in general in American media in relation to Russia and what Russia is doing and how it's responding. And in fact, this is all I really knew about Ukraine prior to coming to Ukraine, and certainly about Mariupol. The only thing I could find about Mariupol on Wikipedia or on Google was either basic facts about Mariupol, like it's on the Sea of Azov, it has around 400,000 people. And then all the news articles that I could find in American media were all about Russia's invasion of Mariupol, or the conflict that escalated in 2014 and the Kerch Strait. And I was like, well, what about? It's more of like, I was like, what else is there to know about Mariupol? Like, tell me something different instead of, 2014 and Russia's invasion, so to speak. Like I couldn't find anything else about Mariupol except very basic facts, you know? So I had a lot of learning to do when I came to Mariupol and when I came to Ukraine. Um, and finally, I just have these questions that I thought about, and maybe I think they're good to end our PowerPoint with, and for us as a whole to think about. You know, as I've said before, what should the U.S. relationship be with Ukraine? Do we want more or less international support? Do you all want more or less international support? Do you want lesser or greater military support? Should there be troops, American troops on Ukrainian soil? I don't know if that's a good idea, you know? And finally, you know, more importantly, I would say is what are the goals and dreams of Ukraine for Ukraine's future? You know, what goals and dreams do you have for Ukraine? And does or should the US play a part in helping Ukrainians to achieve these dreams? Um, you know, maybe honestly, some of you want nothing to do with America, or you don't want America to do anything with Ukraine. Uh, or maybe some of you think the exact opposite. You want more US Ukrainian relationship or greater understanding, so to speak. Um, I don't know. These are questions to guide us forward. And, you know, like if we want the US to be involved, what does our support look like? What should it look like? I don't know. These are things that I think about and I have ideas for, but I don't have a clear answer. I don't, to be honest. So, anyway, these are my thoughts. Again, my thoughts. Not an official thought or policy by anyone. So I want to thank you all for being patient, for listening to my lectures, for listening to my crazy thoughts, maybe. I hope that this was informative. Um, and I also learned a little bit about American history. Again, you know, it's good to learn. But, you know, I hope as much energy and attention as I put to learning American history and teaching American history, I want to do the same for Ukrainian history. I've read a Ukrainian history book, but I still feel very ignorant about it, to be honest. So I need to do research on my part, and I need to learn more on my part. But I hope you all enjoy these lecture series, and feel free to comment and to ask questions. I just want to end with this picture here. I like this picture. It's, of course, has the American and Ukrainian flags. And it was a picture of me with my Priazovsky State Technical University colleagues, Kate on the left and Victoria on the right. I was giving a presentation with PSTU students about tourism in America. And just to also think about how we can increase tourism in Mariupol. It happened February of this year, just before I left. But I loved it, you know, and like this is, you know, I know that maybe we think negatively of US Ukrainian relations, but I like to think there are positives, and like it starts from these moments, from these little interactions. It starts with, you know, me giving a presentation and me listening to you all and hearing about Ukrainian society and Ukrainian history. Um, Universe or things happen, great things can happen too. So, and like I promised, I have here a couple of suggestions on books on general American history. I haven't read a single one of these, but these were well rated. These were well recommended. In particular, this one you might want to look at. Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Gives a good history about racism and racist ideas in America, especially during this time period. So let me just see what your questions are, guys. All right. Thank you for your lectures. I wonder, can it be said that Obama had more support among voters than Trump and had a higher rating after the end of his term? I don't have numbers exactly. This is something I didn't mention about Obama. So, and I don't really know where, you know, we have this big political divide in America. between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. It's like we're fighting. And it's a really bad fight because we're not getting things passed and we're being very mean to each other. We are. And I would say where I really noticed this deep division in America is under Obama. I think so with Obama personally, I think a lot of Republicans and conservatives didn't like Obama because he was a Democratic president. You know, you're not going to like your opponent. During George Bush, Democrats didn't like Bush because he was a Republican and he was passing Republican ideas and policies. I do think that one of the reasons why we had such vitriol and such, I would say, a deep hatred. There was some serious hatred towards Obama, really racist, mean hatred. I think part of it had to do with racism. I do think there were Americans who were not only disgusted with Obama because he was a Democrat, but because he was a black man running our country. And this annoys me, but that's also um, that's part of the beginnings of Trump and his um, political fame in America. When Obama was president, Trump had this weird conspiracy idea that Obama was actually Muslim. He wasn't born in America. It was called the birtherism movement. And it was just part of this conspiracy. And I would say this hatred against Obama that was unfounded, and this conspiracy that Obama wasn't really American, that he was Muslim, which what does that make you un-American? That he was from Africa and that, you know, he had weird ties. And it actually stemmed from Trump. And I don't forgive Trump on that personally. I don't. But it's where I noticed that we have a lot of hatred. So I can't. So why I say all this is because I can't say how much support Obama had. He had a lot of support, of course, from Democrats. But in terms of other Americans, non Democrats and Republicans, I don't know. Because what I remember about Obama is that there were a lot of Democrats that loved him, and there was an equal amount of Republicans and maybe conservatives and non Democrats who hated him. He was a very polarizing figure. And I don't know if it's because of his policies or if it's also has something to do with racism in America. I don't know. You can't, the thing is, I can't prove it to you. I can't prove to you that some Republicans didn't want to work with Obama because they didn't like working with a black man. I can't prove that to you. Maybe they didn't like working for him because he was a Democrat. But I do notice that they were particularly vicious against Obama compared to Bill Clinton, say. But anyway, I don't know. And he did have a high rating, I would say. Well, high in terms of it was like 53 or 57%. And I don't know about Trump. Like Trump right now doesn't have a great approval rating, but it might go up. And as you all know with Trump, he doesn't believe in the polls. He believes that the polls are unfair, that they're skewed, that they're fake. You know, uh, it's just like nothing is real with Trump anymore. What he thinks is real is what it supports him and treats him well. I have a problem with it, guys. As you can tell, I have a problem with Trump. He just really annoys me, to be honest. And it's not because he's a Republican. I actually respect some Republicans. I do. And I don't hate Republican presidents. Like, I don't hate George Bush. I don't even hate Reagan. I don't agree with their policies. But with Trump, it's a different level for me. Um, it's more personal, I guess, so to speak. But again, this is my personal beliefs, not anybody else's. Um, okay, question 2. Hi, that was a great lecture. Do you have an intention to visit Ukraine again someday, or maybe Russia? Um, Definitely Ukraine. I would like to go back and visit. I feel like I didn't end my Fulbright experience properly. I just left. And of course, I continued teaching online, but I felt like I didn't have that closure. I also want to visit other cities in Ukraine. I never visited Poltava, Vinnytsia, never visited the Carpathian Mountains. So I feel like I didn't actually see all of Ukraine. With Russia, I would like to eventually visit maybe like St. Petersburg or Moscow, but I don't actually feel comfortable visiting right now under Putin, especially as someone who is foreign and American, and especially as someone who is openly critical of Putin. I don't know what's going to happen when I step in the airport in Russia. They might arrest me or something. I don't know. But eventually I would like to visit Russia, just maybe under different circumstances, under a different government. Um, Thank you. This lecture course was great. I think our local university should use it to teach students. I hope so. And like I said, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this lecture series is I wanted to show a broad depth of American history, to help you understand it more, and maybe explain why America does what it does, why America thinks the way it does. Um, but as I said, I also want to do the same for Ukrainian history and Ukrainian culture too. And if you all know of any good Ukrainian history books in English or lecture series, please let me know. My email and phone number are in previous lectures. Okay. Thank you for the course. I think that now all residents of Ukraine are happy with the active phase of the war was finished. As for me, the diplomatic support of our country is the best that can be done. I'm against weapons. This topic is still widely discussed by locals. What do American citizens think about the situation? Great question. I will say, in general, as I understand, I think most Americans are happy and fine, so to speak, with U.S. support in Ukraine, especially military and international aid support. You know, not it's. I will say, even though I think that part of our reason why we support Ukraine is because it's quote unquote the enemy of Russia, so to speak, or that Russia sees it as its adversary. I don't know. Um, I will say there are Americans, and I know this because I was with Fulbright, who genuinely care about Ukraine and it has nothing to do with Russia. And there are Americans, I think, even in general, too, who support Ukraine because we support democracies in general. We support any country that's trying to make itself more free and more democratic. It's not just because Ukraine is next to Russia. I mean, that's a facet of it, and it's an important one. But we do generally support the spirit of democracy and the spirit of, you know, reforms and progress, and civil rights, so to speak, and economic reforms. We do. And it's not always because we hate Russia or something like that, or we see Russia as manipulating the situation. So, and I would say for my friends and family, even though they don't think about Ukraine a lot, maybe they don't have a problem with it, and they sympathize with Ukrainians because you're trying to fight a big old country and kind of a bully. So we feel sorry in that regard. Like, man, you got this terrible bully on your back. Um, so anyway, and I think also Congress, as well, as I said, Congress also supports Ukraine too. And that's why I say, like, even though Trump supports maybe Putin or he's friendly to Putin, I would say don't let that detract you. Congress will continue, I believe, to send aid to Ukraine. It will continue to support Ukraine's fight for democracy, for freedom, for sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Even though we broke our memorandum, so to speak, the spirit of the memorandum, the Budapest memorandum, lives on, I would say. So anyway, thank you all. I appreciate you joining me today, and I hope that you found it informative. And I know maybe I said things that are controversial or that you might not agree with, but that's okay. That's part of democracy. I just wish I could talk with you all back more. We could have a discussion, but that's definitely an American ideal, to speak your mind. And I know it's also a Ukrainian ideal. I know when I was in Ukraine, a lot of people spoke their opinions. Maybe not as loudly as I did, but they spoke their opinions. So, but I hope this lecture series gave you more understanding about American history and culture. So thank you.